To make a widget, we're going to first start with a blank Eclipse workspace. This is Eclipse Oxygen, and we're going to install the prerequisite software. So the first software to install is the FRC WPI lib. Okay, so adding the repository first for FRC shows us the WPI lib. In this case, I'm going to install Java. Hit next. Let the software download. And we have another piece of software to install. This would be the JavaFX IDE for Eclipse. That can be found in the Oxygen repository. This is the warning for the WPI lib we need to install anyway. I'm not going to restart just yet. I'm going to restart after I install the Eclipse tools. To find the Eclipse tools, I just filter by E, open parenthesis, FX, close parenthesis. And you see this EFX Eclipse IDE. You want to install that. And that may take a while. And once it's installed, you do want to restart Eclipse. Once Eclipse is restarted, you can create the project. We're going to do this by going to a new Other project and selecting a Maven project. You can type Maven in at the filter bar there. Select Maven project, click Next. Click Next on the first screen. The archetype is automatically selected as Quick Start. Click Next. Group ID, I have it as edu.vortex3735, and I'm going to call the artifact ID my plugin, and click Finish. So the project is defined. If you want to test that things are set up correctly, you want to select Run As, a Maven build. Use the ... version. I'm going to give it the name of Build My Plugin, and in the goals I'm going to put the word package, and I'm going to apply. I'm going to run, and it's going to execute. And it says build success. And if you want to see what it built, you can select the target folder here and select refresh or hit F5. And when you expand it, you'll see a jar that is the place where your plugin code will eventually go when you put it into the project. The next thing to do is to set up the repositories and dependencies that will pull the FRC code over for you to use, and you do this by opening up this pom.xml. It gives this pom editor, but the first thing we're going to do is go into pom.xml itself. You'll notice there's several pieces of data in this markup. For right now, we're going to add only a few things. The first thing is the repository for the FRC code. So if you open this up, open bracket, and you select repositories, and then we're going to select repository, and the ID, we'll just call it FRC. The name, we'll say it's FRC Maven repository, and the URL is from the Shuffleboard documentation. So first.wpi.edu/frc/maven/release, and Control-Shift-F to auto format and save it. The next thing to do is add the dependencies, and we're going to go to the dependency tab to do this, and you can see there's already one dependency that's been put there that was added by the project creation wizard. We're going to add the Shuffleboard dependency first, so when we click add, and the group ID is edu.wpi.first.shuffleboard. And the artifact ID is API, and the version as of the making of this video was 1.1.0. And we click OK. Now I'm going to save this, and it's going to try and download the dependencies, and normally any dependencies that are cascaded from that dependency should download, but for some reason, and I haven't really looked into this very much, it is missing other dependencies. So I'm going to add these dependencies one by one, and we were able to make this work by adding these dependencies. So add, again, group ID edu.wpi.first.wpi-util, the artifact ID wpi-util-java, and the version 3.0.0. I'm going to add the NT core. So edu.wpi.first.nt-core, the artifact nt-core-java version 4.0.0, and then the nt-core JNI, edu.wpi.first.nt-core, the artifact ID is nt-core-jni version 4.0.0, and click OK. And I'll save this, and it still won't work. Go back to the pom.xml, and you'll notice that all these dependencies have been created inside the pom. And in the JNI, there's one other thing to add, which is the classifier, and it's just the word all. So now you notice that all the warnings went away. You can go back to the dependencies, and there's no outstanding red dependencies or missing dependencies. So in theory, you have all the dependent code you need to make a very basic plugin. Now that we have all the dependencies set up in Maven, we can create our first plugin. And the thing to note is that the plugin contains one or more widgets, so we have to create the plugin first, and then we can create our widgets that you can see in the Shuffleboard. So to do that, I'm going to go to the app.java that was created by the project setup wizard, and I'm going to modify it a bit to become the plugin. So I'm going to delete this hello world comment and the main method, and I'm going to say extends plugin. And if you hover over this, the suggestion will be import edu WPI first Shuffleboard API plugin. So that's exactly the one you want. All that's required to create the plugin, or at least an empty plugin, is to add the annotation of description. And if you hover over it, it will say import the description from API.plugin. So there's two different types. There's one from API widget, one from API plugin. When you're making the plugin, you want to use the API plugin import. And you can hover over this and say add missing attributes. And you can say what is your group. In this case, VorTX 3735. Say name, my plugin. And for summary, just put a test plugin. And version 1.0.0. And save that. Now if you go ahead and run your Maven build, remember we made this build to build the plugin, execute that, so it'll create the package. And when it's done, you can open up Shuffleboard. Once Shuffleboard's open, you can load the plugin package. Now keep in mind there's no widgets in this package. I'm just doing this for an example to show you where the plugin is showing up in Shuffleboard. So I'm going to File, Plugins, and I'm going to load plugin. So you can see that they already have some plugins loaded by default. I'll load plugin, and I have it in my Eclipse workspace, my plugin, target, and there's my plugin jar. And you can see it show up and show you some of the fields from the description annotation as well as the version. So at this point the plugin is loaded. It just will not put any widgets in the widget list, so this is just an example. Now that we know the plugin is working, we can begin to create some widgets. So the first thing we need to do is have the class that derives from plugin tell Shuffleboard which classes are widgets. We do that. We can go in there and override the getComponents method. So control space, getComponents, and the examples on the Shuffleboard wiki show it returning an immutable list. So we'll return immutable list dot of Control Shift O to import immutable list, and widget type, again Control Shift O to import widget type for annotated widget, and I'm just going to put mywidget.class. And right now this will not compile because mywidget.class doesn't exist. Oh, I spelled for annotated widget wrong. Okay. Now we can create the widget implementation. I'm going to add a new class in the same namespace as my plugin class. I'm in a new class. I'm going to call it mywidget. And the superclass is going to be simple annotated widget. Finish. Okay, it creates the class, and we need to implement unimplemented methods because simple annotated widget is a abstract class. And it creates the getPane view. Next you can add the annotation, which is @description. And you'll want to import this time the widget description instead of the plugin description. And you can then add missing attributes. Now for data types at the moment, just put in boolean.class. We won't worry about this for this example. And the name, we'll just call it my test widget. And the other thing you notice is that this doesn't compile because it's complaining about the generic type argument. You can remove that for now. Now that the widget has been basically defined, we need to go back and fix the plugin class. So we go back to app.java, and in this case the error is related to the way Maven set up my Eclipse project. So you may or may not be having this error, but the error is telling me references to interface static methods are allowed only at source level 1.8 or above. So basically my project was created to compile it an older version of Java, and we need to make sure it's compiling at 1.8. So the easy way to do that is go to the properties of the project, go to the Java compiler option, and change it from 1.5, which is where I'm assuming everybody's project is going to be created, and set it at 1.8. And if I say apply and close, it'll ask me to compile. Go ahead and say yes. And you can see now that all the classes compile. Now that we have the code compiling for the plugin and the widget, we need to add the view that will be displayed by Shuffleboard. So we start that in the widget class by adding another annotation called parameterized controller. And so we'll have that. We'll import it from the widget API, and note that the spelling of parameterized is not the correct spelling. That's okay. You can add the missing attributes, and for the value we're going to put mywidget.fxml. So now that we've defined this file that's going to display the UI, we need to add the file. So the first thing to do is add this in a resource folder. So we're going to add another folder, another source folder to the project. And we do that by right-clicking on the project, going new, and saying source folder. And we're going to use source main resources. I'm going to add that. And in that folder, we're going to add a package that is named the same as the package that hosts our widget and our plugin. And finish. And in here, we're going to add the FXML. So you do that by going new, other, and choosing FXML and for a new FXML document. Click next, and we call it my widget. Now the root element we're going to leave as a grid pane at the moment, and click finish. And this is the file that is the layout view for the component, or the widget. The first thing to do is to wire it up to the controller class, and you go to the root element of grid pane, type fx:controller, and you give the full namespace of the class, edu.vortex373.myplugin.mywidget, and that is now the controller. So now we need to be able to tell Shuffleboard that this is the root pane for the display. And we do that by going again into the root element of grid pane and giving it an identifier. So fx:id, and we're going to call it underscore the pane. And so what this is it will allow JavaFX to give an instance of this display to the controller class, which is myWidget. So I'm going to go to myWidget, and I'm going to define a protected instance of pane, and I'm going to call it the pane. And the last thing I need to do is put an @fxml annotation, and Control-Shift-O to fix that. And what that means is that the pane underscore the pane will have an instance of the pane that I need to give to Shuffleboard when it asks for the get view. And so I can now go in there and substitute the pane for the view. So now our plugin and our widget compile, but there's really nothing in the view that can be displayed or interacted with by Shuffleboard. So let's go ahead and add something very simple to the view. Go back to the FXML, and I'm going to add just a simple button with the text of push me. And then I need to import the button control. javafx.scene.control.button. So then we'll run the Maven build to rebuild the jar, and we'll try and load it in Shuffleboard. So once again, we're in Shuffleboard, and I'm going to load the plugin direct from my workspace. And get it from the target folder in my project, and here's my plugin jar. So it's loaded the plugin again. I can close this, and I can go to widgets. And if I scroll down, I should see my widget show up down here, and sure enough, here is my widget, my test widget, and the button that says push me. So if I add a tab, I can drag this over, and now I have my widget. I can press the button, but my widget doesn't do anything. So let's try and make it do something interesting. So we're back in Eclipse, and I'm in the FXML editor, and I think what we'll do is make a button that when pressed will display an incremented number and a decremented number. So we'll do that by showing also some properties of the grid pane, and basically just for people that aren't familiar with JavaFX, the grid pane is a layout pane that gives a tabular layout of different controls and even other layouts internally. Probably you'll want to Google grid pane and get familiar with some of the layouts for JavaFX, but I'll show how grid pane works here just briefly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this button in the 0 index column of the grid pane by saying gridpane.columnIndex equals 0. So this is the very first column, and I'm going to put it also in the very first row. Gridpane.rowIndex equals 0. But I'm also going to span it across 2 rows. So gridpane.rowSpan is 2. And the next thing I'm going to add is I'm going to add a label. And so label, and I'm going to give it some default text. We'll call it default 1 for this case. And I'm going to give this an ID. So fx ID equals, we'll say underscore negnum. And I'm going to add another label with text equal to default 2. And I'm going to give it an ID of underscore posnum. Now for both of these, for the negative number, I'm going to put it in row 0, but column index 1. So grid pane row index equals 0, and grid dot column index equals 1. And I'm going to do something very similar to the next label, except I'm going to give it a row index of 1. So if you remember, we put this ID up here for the pane. We're going to do the same thing for pause and negative number in our widget class. So go back to the widget class and protected label negnum and protected label pause num. And I'm going to add the fxml attribute again for each of these. And they should bind to the controls in the fxml document. I'm going to say Control-Shift-O to fix the label for JavaFX. Make sure you bring the JavaFX label in. And now I have the controller wired to use these label fields. So let's go back to the controller and implement a few other fields. So we'll just do an integer underscore neg and int underscore pause, and we'll initialize both of these to 0. So now I have the components I need to implement a increment and decrement number and just display it in each of these labels as the button is pressed. The thing I'm missing is what happens in this class when the button's pressed. So I'm going to go back to the fxml, and there is a attribute called onAction, and you can make it call a function call in your controller by prefixing a function method with a hash mark, and I'm going to say on button press. So if I go to my controller, I can say at fxml protected void on button press without the hash mark, obviously, and it takes an action event E. So this action event, you'll want to import the JavaFX version of the action event. You'll note there's an AWT one, but it's the JavaFX one that you want. And in this one, it's very simple. I'm going to decrement neg and increment pause. And I'm going to set the text of negnum to the negative value. Negnum set text, and I want to say integer dot toString and underscore neg. And I'm going to do the same thing for the positive label. And there's several different ways of doing this. This is just a very simple way of doing it so that it's a good example for beginners for JavaFX. More advanced people will want to do something like property binding. But for now, this is going to be our example. So let's go ahead and build it in Maven. And we'll try it again in Shuffleboard. So here we are in Shuffleboard. I'm going to once again load my plugin from my Eclipse workspace. And get it from my target directory. And you can see it's now loaded. And I'm going to go to widgets, and I'm going to scroll down to find my widget. And here's my test widget again. I'm going to add it to the tab. And so you see that I have two labels. I have a button, and the button is spanning two rows, and each label is in the column index 1 where the button's in column index 0, and each label is taking only one row. So this is a tabular layout. And the text I set in the label for the default text is here, and when I push the button, it changes to the incremented or decremented number. You'll note that the resizing affects the controls differently. You'll have to play with how that works when the Shuffleboard widgets are resized. But in general, that's a very basic widget. So now that you have the ability to create a widget, you may want to do things like run Shuffleboard under the debugger to debug issues with your widget or debug what it's doing when it receives data. So let me go over how to do that next. So we're back in Eclipse, and one of the very common things people will want to do when they're developing software is to run the software they're developing in a debugger, so that I can set breakpoints on the code, and as the code is running, it stops running and lets me step through the code so I can view what's happening to the variables or follow the execution of the code. So in order to do that, I need to define a debug configuration. So I'm going to go up to and look at my debug configurations. I'm going to create a new Java application debugger. So let's go ahead and select Java application, select new, and I'm going to just call this debug my widget. And the project is my plugin, and we're going to put the main class as the Shuffleboard class, edu.wpi.first.shuffleboard.app.shuffleboard. And in the class path, I'm going to add a external jar, which is the Shuffleboard jar. So I already have this set to my user tools, but you can go to %user profile. On Windows this works. If you're on a Mac or Linux, you may have to use something different. WPI lib/tools. And add the Shuffleboard jar. So I'm going to apply and close. So now I can run my debug. Actually, let me go to debug configurations again and select my debug my widget and say debug and let it run. And so you'll notice down here in the console that Shuffleboard is spooling data out to the console, and now we show Shuffleboard. But let me go back to Eclipse real quick, and you'll see that it constantly is sitting there trying to connect to the network tables server. It may be useful to run network tables while you're debugging. So if you go up here and run the outline viewer, and you can run it in server mode, so it starts in client or server, it will make Shuffleboard think that the robot is alive and this is the network table server for the robot. So we go back to Shuffleboard, and once again I can load my widget or my plugin from my workspace. And you remember I put a breakpoint on my button, and immediately Eclipse wants to break out to debug mode. There's some sort of a exception that causes it to break out. And if this is the first time in this project you've run debug, it warns you of the perspective view, and you can say, remember my decision, and click yes. And so it breaks out into a view where it will show you source code. You can just continue running and resume by clicking the run button or click F8 and go back to Shuffleboard. So now the plugin's loaded, and I'm going to go to the widgets. If you remember, Well, let me put the widget on the board first. So here's my widget. I'm going to add it to a board here. Now if you remember, I put in my code a breakpoint when the button's clicked. So if I click the button, it should bring me back to Eclipse to let me step through the code. So click the button, and sure enough, Eclipse has stopped, and you can see the run head here. And I now can hover over variables, or I can look at this local variables table up here in the corner. And I can view in this table, I can expand this, and I can see a lot of the variables and expand them and look into details that are inside these classes and objects. And I can step through each line of code by hitting F6. So I can just follow the execution of my application, and you'll note here that Eclipse highlights variables that changed after this last step. And I can just again hit resume to continue running as normal and go back to Shuffleboard. And every time I click push me, Eclipse will show me the debugger. And if I'm done debugging, I can hit stop, and then it will automatically shut down Shuffleboard. And I'm still in the debug perspective. If you go up here in the corner, you can go back to the Java perspective. Now, constantly going through the motion of loading your plugin from your Eclipse workspace is probably going to get a bit annoying. So there's actually a way that you can make Shuffleboard automatically load your plugin. And what we'll do is we'll actually have, at the time of build, the jar copied to the location where Shuffleboard will automatically pull in the plugin. So if you go to the pom.xml again, this is done through Maven. On the project level, I can add a build element, and in this build element I can add plugins, and I'm going to add a plugin, and the artifact ID is going to be maven-antrun plugin, and my version is going to be 1.8. My execution, so this is a little bit of copy and paste, but you can find this pretty much anywhere online. I'm just going to go through defining some of the executions here and the configuration. So the execution, of course I spelled executions wrong. I'm going to say phase is package, and configuration, and I'm going to say tasks. So inside tasks is just Apache Ant directives to perform operations. So I'm going to use a copy directive, and I'm going to say toDir equals, and in user home, where wpilib is installed by default, Shuffleboard, when it runs, creates a folder called Shuffleboard, and inside there is a folder called plugins. So if you copy your jar to that folder, plugins, Shuffleboard will load your plugin automatically at startup. So now that I have a destination directory, I actually have to tell it which files to copy, and you do that through file set dir equals target and include name equals star.jar. And after configuration, I need to put goals. This is part of the Maven plugin setup, and a single goal of run. And then I'm going to format it. This will be in GitHub. You can copy and paste this from the POM later. Just showing you how, this is just showing you how to include the file copy as part of the Maven build. So if I go to my Maven build, and it says build success. So if I again run debug, and that will run Shuffleboard. And I can see that it loaded my plugin, but let me load the plugins anyway. And you can see my plugins already in memory. So now I can go to widgets, and again, find my widget, add it to a tab, and just the button. And that's pretty much it. More videos will come when I work through how to add data sources and connect data sources to widgets. But for now, this is a sample widget to get everybody going with a very simple way to have an interactive widget in Shuffleboard.